let's begin. Last week we talked about the relationship between law and principle. We said that law is not about right or wrong, but rather it's about a principle. Which means that there are times when it is in fact wrong to follow a certain law if following that law contradicts the principle that was behind the creating of that law in that moment. As I'm sure we are all well aware, there are always times when following a rule or a law can do more harm than good. We use the example of the law of Deuteronomy 24 regarding divorce, and Jesus' treatment of that law in the book of Matthew. Jesus said it was given because of their hardness of heart, not because it was the right thing for them to do. Then Jesus effectively overturns that particular law because the principle behind the law was more important than the law itself. We would say that the Pharisees missed the heart of the law. We concluded by saying that whenever we read our Bibles and we come across a command or a law, we must ask why it was given in order to find the principle behind it, and therefore to more fully understand and follow the heart and the intention of that law. Our example in Deuteronomy 24 showed us that the principle and the intention of the law regarding divorce, in fact, didn't have much to do with the divorce, but it was about protecting the outcast and downtrodden. And in that specific case, it was about protecting women. Attempting to find the principle behind every law and word we find in Scripture can be an arduous task. It's a lot of work, isn't it? More work than maybe we have time for, maybe more work than we have the knowledge for. Without some form of key or legend, it can become an impossible task, unless we all end up becoming scholars, never allowing our noses to leave our Bibles. And as we talked about this morning, it's more important that we practice the law rather than knowing the law, so therefore that would inhibit us from even being able to practice it. Kind of negates the point. As we should well know, Jesus never intended for all of us to be scholars. Right? Because that's a lot of work, and I'll admit, I read a lot, but and I've said this before, I don't like reading. I read because I value knowledge and I enjoy learning, but I do not like to read. So I have to force myself to read. It's become such a case now that I read so much that I don't read for fun anymore. I used to read fiction books and things like that, but I don't do it because I read so much that it's just like, I don't want to read again. So thank God that we were not all meant to be scholars, right? Even though He intended some of us to be. This means that there must be some keys, some shortcuts, so to speak, to understanding God's principles behind His Word. There's one specifically that I want to talk about today. One key that we should realize is behind every single word in the Bible, and that is of relationship. Relationship can be used to interpret every single word in the Bible. We should understand that as we read our Bibles, that there's more than one. One of the underlying principles that informs every word is that of relationship. I can confidently say that without exception, every single line in our Bibles is for the intention of either preserving or promoting relationship between ourselves and God and between each other. We mentioned last week a passage from Revelation 21 that talked about how God's home, His dwelling place, was with us, with His children, with His creation. We understand one of the most basic concepts of creation is we were meant to be in relationship with God. We oftentimes make the assumption that if we have God, there is nothing else that we could ever need. But do we realize that that assumption is wrong? In Genesis, God created man, and God walked in the garden with man, living out relationship with him. But do we realize that man was found to be alone? God was not all that man needed. God created us to need relationship with God. The book of Romans defines human depravity as life without God's presence. But God created us with a need for more than just relationship with Himself. God created us to have need for relationship with one another. If this were not the case, then God would not have said in Genesis 2 that an appropriate companion could not be found in the garden, or that it was not good for man to be alone. Man was not alone. God was there. God walked with him. But God is saying that God alone is not enough to fulfill our created need for relationship. We were created to need something more than just God. That is why the church cannot be the church unless it is a community. That's why it's so important to be involved in a church body. It's really difficult to have that kind of relationship without ever showing up to church. It's not a matter of this is just something simply good for us. But it is necessary for us to be together and essential in order for us to be the church, and even in order for us to be fully human, that we are together. We cannot be what we were created to be without these kinds of relationships in our lives. So we hear that. All of us have a created purpose, right? Okay? What we are saying is that if we have God and God alone, we cannot fulfill that created purpose. We must have God and relationship with the community of the church. With God and those around us, with humanity. And we must note that this does not just mean the community of the church and nobody else. We should be in a relationship with the church, relationship with God, and a relationship with our neighbors and people we come across. We should be in a relationship with everyone. Good relationship. We talked about this morning, how do we know if that baptism, if that circumcision has cut through to the heart? It's not just a matter of I got wet. How do we know? Well, look at our relationships. And we're not just talking about who we are, who we're good friends with people we interact with on a daily basis. How many of our relationships are good relationships? If we have more bad relationships than good relationships, then we might want to look inwards at ourselves and wonder, has that baptism really cut through to the heart? I hope that as we're talking about this, I'm conveying how important relationship is. Do you see how important this is? You cannot accomplish your purpose without relationships. It's absolutely essential to everything. Without it, there cannot be joy, peace, hope. It sounds a lot like the fruits of the Spirit, doesn't it? There cannot be the fruits of the Spirit without the relationships that we have, not just with God, but with one another. Our relationships with God and His people are the foundation to a fulfilled and prosperous life. Just to make sure we're all getting the point here, let me say it one more time. God Himself says that simply having God and nothing else is not enough to be fulfilled. These are God's words, not ours. God said a suitable companion cannot be found for Adam. God was not enough for Adam. Adam needed God and humanity. We need both relationship with God and other people. If our relationships are so important to our very existence, then we must realize that they must be protected at all costs. Relationship must be our very first and foremost concern. Sometimes that can become difficult when you realize that some decisions that we must make tend to increase relationships with some, but may hinder relationships with others. And sometimes decisions we must make for the good of a relationship hinder for the moment. And so in comes the law. As we said from the beginning, every bit of the law can be interpreted with the principle of preserving or increasing relationships. We touched on this a little bit last week, and we touched on it quite a bit in our morning and Wednesday classes. Law is for the purpose of protecting and promoting relationships. With this in mind, we need to redefine what it means to sin. Sin is not a matter of right and wrong. If you were here Wednesday, you've already heard this. Sin is not a matter of right and wrong. It's not a matter of, did I break a law or not? An action is not a sin because you broke some rule you knew that you were not supposed to break. An action is a sin because it harms your relationship with God, other people, or both. It's a sin because you knew that some other person really wished you hadn't done that. In Ephesians chapter 2, it says that Jesus has broken down in his flesh the dividing wall of hostility. Thank you, Fred, for reading that earlier for us. Sin can be defined as any action which erects a dividing wall of hostility between ourselves and any other person or God, to rebuild what Christ has torn down. Sin is pain inflicted upon someone else. Sin is my choice to harm our relationship because of my self-centeredness. Much of the books of the prophets in the Old Testament is set up like a court case. Israel is being taken to court. God has taken his people to court. They have sinned and they have broken the covenant. Legal charges are being brought against them. But do you know what charges are being brought against them? Turn over with me to Jeremiah chapter 3. Jeremiah chapter 3. Starting in verse 6. The Lord said to me in the days of King Josiah, "Have you seen what she did, that faithless one Israel? How she went up on every high hill and under every green tree, and there she played the whore? And I thought, after she had done all this, she will return to me. But she did not return. And her treacherous sister Judah saw it. She saw that for all the adulteries of that faithless one Israel, I had sent her away with a decree of divorce." We hear that, right? God has divorced Israel here in the book of Jeremiah. Yet her treacherous sister Judah did not fear, but she too went and played the whore. Because she took her whoredom lightly, she polluted the land, committing adultery with stone and tree. Yet for all this, her treacherous sister Judah did not return to me with her whole heart, but in pretense, declares the Lord. What is Israel's crime? Well, the crimes of Israel and Judah are a lot, aren't they? There have been disgusting acts committed by these people. But ultimately, the charge brought against them in courts comes down to this. They have forsaken their relationship with God and been faithless. They are taken to court not because they broke some rule, but because they have broken a relationship. Their sin is sin because it has destroyed their relationship with their Father. Notice here again our point from last week. God has essentially broken the law of Deuteronomy 24. He divorced Israel and then later attempted to pursue her again to take her back. No matter how you twist it, it doesn't sound good. It is illegal, according to Deuteronomy 24, for God to take back Israel. If God follows the letter of the law, then Jesus would have never come. Because in sending Jesus, God broke the law of Deuteronomy 24. But again, remember that the law is about what? The principle. And the principle is relationship. And if the principle is relationship, then God has in fact fulfilled the law, not broken it. So has God sinned by breaking the law? No, of course not. Because the purpose of the law is to promote and to protect the relationship, not to destroy it. So in this moment, for God to follow the law would be sinful. You hear that? For God to follow the law in that moment would be the sinful act. Because the law would destroy relationship. So God pursues his bride despite her infidelity. Sin is about breaking and tearing down a relationship. Israel has sinned because they have been faithless in their relationship with God. And God has broken the law in order to be faithful to Israel. Both have essentially broken the law, but only one has sinned. This theme is spoken over and over again. But breaking relationship with God is not their only crime. They've destroyed relationship with one another as well. In Isaiah chapter 3, verse 14 and 15, it brings attention to another charge. It says, "It is you who have devoured the vineyard. The spoil of the poor is in your houses. What do you mean by crushing my people, by grinding the faces of the poor, declares the Lord of hosts." Here's the Lord God of hosts. Sin is always against someone. What is sin but a violation of relationship with the other? We need to have the eyes to see that even actions that we commit on our own, in private, apart from others, greatly affects others, and therefore would still be a sin against them. Just because we do it when nobody's around doesn't make it not a sin. Even those actions that we try to justify as having no harm to anyone, so many times it harms our relationship with God, and therefore still remains sinful. Every single choice we make, no matter how private it is, affects someone else. Therefore, every choice must be made with the intention of creating greater relationship. Think about the works of the flesh described in Galatians chapter 5. Then the following fruits of the Spirit. The work of the flesh are sexual immorality, impurity, sensuality, idolatry, sorcery, enmity, strife, jealousy, fits of anger, rivalries, dissensions, divisions, envy, drunkenness, orgies, and things like these. Do any of those works of the flesh surprise you? Do you realize that every single one of those are actions that directly, negatively impact our relationships with one another or God? If this is the list of big sins, so to speak, and we should note that there are no big sins, sin is sin, then doesn't this seem to be telling us that in the center is rivalries, angers, dissension, and the like? In the center of all these works of the flesh, in fact, outnumbering all the others, are ones that impact our relationships with one another. Who would count jealousy, envy, or rivalry as one of the big ones needing to be called out? Do we put as much emphasis about the words and what kind of words we use towards one another as we do about whether you went out to drink last night or whether you're committing adultery or not? Because according to this, we should be putting just as much, if not more, emphasis on the kind of words we use. Denise noticed something last week. I know I've already used this on Wednesday night. As we were discussing Romans chapter 1. In the list of all of how depraved humanity was, there was this list of all these terrible things they were doing. And you know, right in the center of all these terribly depraved things, in the middle of the worst, was listed, are you two listening? Disobedience to parents. Ooh. Listed right in the middle of things like murder, being an inventor of evil, being ruthless, and a gossip. In the middle of that was being disobedient parents. That seems to be an odd pairing, doesn't it? Well, it's an odd pairing until we realize that sin is all about harming relationships. Look to the fruits of the Spirit, and you'll see it is again all about relationships. Love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control. Against such things there is no law. Why bother to point out that there is no law against these things? So that it might be shown that these things are the very purpose of the law. These things are the principles behind every word in the Bible. These things are all about relationships. Are we beginning to grasp what this means for our concept of sin? And understand how important and how much it affects the way we read our Bibles? Why, maybe in Romans 2, as we were talking this morning, the Jews got in trouble for judging the Gentiles. Was the judgment right? Yes. But was the act of judging them right? No. Why? Because it utterly destroyed their relationships. Remember I said last week that every single word in our Bibles, even those in the Old Testament, every one are applicable today if we understand the principle and the heart behind the words. If we read our Bibles with the understanding that it is all about relationships, and all of its words are for the purpose of building them up, I believe that we can, to some degree, grant ourselves some understanding that may not have been there before. We may not understand what's being said in this text, but if we read this text with the understanding that this text has something to do with building or preserving a relationship, then even the most difficult text, if worked enough, can become a little more easy to understand. We can see the heart of God consistent from beginning to end. And where we do not see a relationship as the core, we will realize that we're probably missing something, and that we must tread carefully. It's okay to say that we don't understand, that we don't know. What's wrong is when we don't know and say we understand, then take it and run with it. I know that if we start with this understanding, if we start with the understanding that relationship is the most important concept in the Bible, as the very purpose of creation, and it's the principle behind every law that is given, if we start with that concept as we read, we can begin to have a more fulfilling experience with our Bible. And more importantly, we can have a more fulfilling relationship with our God and with each other.